So I'm Dr. Jeralyn Brossfield, and I'm excited to talk about fat burning tonight because I think the principles behind why we burn fat and how we burn fat are probably the most important thing to understand in how to create long-term health. Even if you get your body weight to a perfect body weight, understanding these principles are really the key to staying healthy for your whole life and preventing disease and thriving. So I love this topic, and along the way, if there's something that I'm saying that you want me to clarify, or I'll try to pause and ask for questions along the way so we make sure we all are understanding. So like I think I've said to many of you when we've talked, it feels really confusing to know what to eat. This is a 2011 cover of Time. Think, what should we eat now? There was the ups and downs of cholesterol. This is back in 1984 when we were saying, okay, gosh, cholesterol may be related to heart disease. And you can see eggs at that point were in jail, so to speak. We now think eggs are out of jail and it's okay to eat them, but that's been a confusing saga. And certainly, we've often, I feel like our whole society is stuck on the idea that we need to exercise more, and that would be the key to ultimate health if we were all just exercising. And then most recently, this was last year, 2014, we've all been told it's fine to eat butter and fat now. So now I feel like we're all really confused. And in fact, in March of 2015, the new dietary guidelines were released that said there is no correlation with the fat we eat and our blood fat. So in other words, we could eat all the cholesterol we wanted and it would not change our fat in our body. And so when we look at all of these things, I feel like it's no wonder that people are confused at what to do. There's so much information out there that almost seems to be conflicting over time. So I don't know if you've heard this. It feels like this is sort of the oldest truism about weight. And this scales, the picture of calories in, calories out, is sort of based on something called the law of thermodynamics. And the law of thermodynamics says that energy is always conserved. So a system, our body being a system, would always have a conservation of energy in that whatever we put in would equal what would come out. And that in that system, the rest of that situation, the rest of those calories would be sustained or preserved. And so when we look at this law of thermodynamics has been really the key to most weight loss guidance, really for a couple decades at least, maybe 3 or 4 decades. This is the basis of the idea of, okay, let's count our calories, and if I take in 1,500 calories and I burn 2,500 calories in my day, then I ought to have a calorie deficit and should lose weight. So theoretically, if you look at this slide, this is kind of describing that law of thermodynamics and the basis of what most of us have really been educated about weight loss. So for instance, on the top line, if you can see here, if our body's metabolism burns 2,000 calories a day and we were to take in an equal amount of calories per day, we would maintain our weight. Whereas if we ate more calories in our day than our body burned, we would gain weight. Or if we ate less calories in a day than our body burned, we would lose weight. And then here at the bottom, you can see it shows you that if you were to eat less calories a day, plus you burned extra calories exercising, you would lose weight faster. And this picture is sort of the description of what I think, like I said, all of us have been raised on this, thinking we need to exercise more so that we lose weight faster. We need to both reduce, what have we all kind of thought that doctors would say to us if we went to the doctor and asked about weight loss? You need to eat less and exercise more. And this is a description of that theory, I guess I would say. But there's a problem with this theory, and I don't know if any of you have experienced it. Many people that I've talked to and that have been both my patients and people I've studied under have described extreme amounts of exercise. So for instance, one of the physicians that I look up to in looking at food research used to exercise 4 hours a day and was still extremely overweight. And I don't know if you know anyone like that. Sometimes all of us have done that at different points in our lives where we will exercise incredible amounts and still maintain a body weight that isn't a healthy body weight. And so we know, that a lot of times the whole theory of can you burn off what you eat doesn't seem to play out in a way that really results in great weight or body shape or turnout. It's hard to get to your goal this way. And, theoretically, we could burn, like, think about Biggest Loser, right? They exercise, 8 hours a day. And so they're burning more calories than they're taking in. And so theoretically that works. But when you look at the practical application in our lives, I don't know anyone who can consistently exercise more than 1 or 2 hours a day. And, there are a few people that can really be dedicated for periods of time and exercise a significant amount every day. And doing that, for instance, to burn off an extra 500 calories usually is going to take about 2 hours, depending on the intensity of one's exercise. And the difficulty of using that technique to burn off the extra food we eat is tough because it's so easy to take in calories. I mean, think about Starbucks. We now, have the calories listed underneath your favorite drink. And most of the drinks in Starbucks, if you buy one of the flavored drinks with cream and sugar in it, are going to have between 350 and 550 calories. So those would require 2 hours of exercise just to get rid of the Starbucks you drank, let alone the extra food if you put a little bit of extra croutons and salad dressing on your salad at lunch or other places where our calories might creep up. One of the studies that was profound to me in looking into this was, what if we exercised more? Should we theoretically lose more weight? And, if you're subscribing to the law of thermodynamics, the more energy you expend, the more calories you ought to burn. So if you look at this study, 4 groups of women exercised for 6 months. They were taking in the same amount calorically, they didn't actually even track their calories. They just had them exercise, And so in those 4 groups, they had a group that was exercising 72 minutes a week, another group that was exercising 136 minutes a week, another group 194 minutes a week, and a 4th group that did no extra exercise. And the result was that there was no difference in weight loss between those who exercised a lot and those who exercised 0. So when you look at that and say, well, why would that be? I started to slip up and give you my punchline earlier there when I was saying about calories. The results were no difference because those who exercised more canceled out the effect of their exercise by eating more. And the tendency with exercise is that whether it's emotionally or physically from a craving standpoint, we tend to reward ourselves if we exercise harder, or we're more hungry if we exercise harder. And so our tendency is to compensate with higher calories or feel unsatisfied physically as far as feeling hungry or feeling like we have a craving for something. And so that compensation effect makes it really difficult, even with extreme amounts of exercise, to make a significant difference in our weight. So I want to offer an alternative way of looking at all of this, because if we said, okay, calories in, calories out are not an adequate description of what's going on in our body, what if we shifted the perspective and said, okay, what if what we eat influences all the things we can do, and all those things, including what we eat, influence what we eat next? So for instance, if I were to eat, let's say, a carb-heavy meal, let's say I had pizza, my drive to eat again is going to be very different than if I had broccoli and a piece of steak. So when we eat a carb-rich meal, the digestion of that food creates a situation inside our body that drives what we eat next. So for instance, there's a subtle difference between that law of thermodynamics of saying, okay, calories in, calories out, versus saying, okay, what if there's all these other factors that drive what we eat, and what we eat then drives these other factors? And so that really it's not just a calories in, calories out story, but it is very different depending on what we eat and how we eat it. So when we look at the effects of certain foods in our system, we know that they have different effects. When we eat fat, it doesn't raise our blood sugar, for instance, whereas when we eat a carbohydrate, it raises our blood sugar. And I'm going to show you why that might drive you to eat differently than if you had eaten a meal that was just fat or protein. So the bottom line is, instead of just thinking of it being calories in equaling calories out, it really is about the patterns of how we eat and how those can impact the internal processes of the body. Our typical American diet, actually, the average American diet consists of about 450 grams of carbohydrates in a day. So just to give you a framework of what that is, if you were going to have a regular yogurt, it's going to have more like 35 grams of carbohydrate in it, 26 grams of sugar, and a bit more carb with it. So when you look at 450 grams of carbohydrate in a day, that's a diet that's heavily loaded with carbs. And in fact, we know that that amount of carbohydrates equals about 65% of the calories that a typical American takes in. So most American diets are 65% carbohydrates or 450 grams of carbohydrates. And this is sort of just a breakdown of what those are made up of. You can see that fruits and vegetables, are kind of a minimal amount, whereas flours and cereals really equal about a quarter of the calories in a typical American diet. This is a doctor saying to his patient, that high carb diet I put you on 20 years ago gave you diabetes, high blood pressure, and heart disease. Oops. And I am sorry that that's unfortunately closer to reality than I would like to admit. And I would say it's not just our physicians, but it's our whole society, and even guidelines that have been established by our government. And I would suggest looking into this if you're at all a history buff, because we've really been led down a path that wasn't because of health. It was because of a lot of other competing interests in recommending certain diets. So if we were going to look at what could we do instead of just thinking that it was about counting calories and controlling calories in versus calories out, I'm going to give you 3 principles, and then I'm going to show you what's behind those principles that makes them effective. So the first principle would be mastering calories and insulin. So yes, if you eat in excess of calories, your body will probably try to store those calories. And so keeping caloric intake in the realm of what your body can use makes sense. And so to do that, we want to think of portion control. I often recommend people look at their plates and think about, okay, on my plate, what does 9 inches look like? A lot of us have a rim around the edge of our plates, and if you fill your plate to that inner rim, that's really more of a 9-inch section of your plate. If you think of a 9-inch circle, that filled with food, not piled super high, but realistically filled with food, is approximately the amount of food a person could eat at a larger meal. The other principle is let's fuel every 3 hours, and I'll show you in a moment why that's so important. When we think about keeping metabolism going, small amounts of fuel frequently make a big difference. And then we're going to talk about the ratio of food that we eat, why it would make sense to eat our food in certain ratios so that we keep our blood sugar steady. The second principle of helping a person optimize their weight would be to stay full. And so just like the women that exercised and didn't have any difference in their weight loss because some of them ate more than others, and they were the group that exercised more than the others, if we can stay full in the process of trying to lose weight or even maintain our weight, staying full is a really huge protection for us. This is probably one of the biggest reasons why protein is a significant component of most weight loss plans, because protein fills you up more than other foods. Fiber also fills you up without any calories. We also know if you eat slowly that you eat less. This was a great little demonstration for us at Thanksgiving dinner. We had friends over that have a almost 2-year-old who was needing to leave the table. She was not going to sit still through Thanksgiving dinner, and her dad had just filled his plate and eaten maybe a third of his plate when he needed to take her outside to run around for a little while just to help her hold it together. And when he came back in about 25 minutes later, he sat down ready to eat, and we warmed his food back up because, you know what's weird? I'm not even hungry. And it was a great example. There's about a 20-minute lag between when we eat and when our intestines signal that we're full. And so it takes about 20 minutes for the food to work its way down through the intestines and then send a signal back up to the brain to say you've had enough food. So if we eat slowly, we'll tend to eat less because we'll get a signal that says, hey, you've had enough, if we give our body time to send that signal. Staying full also is helped by having water. A lot of times if you have water before a meal or throughout the day, you'll tend to be less hungry. And then eating foods with low caloric density, but high volume. So kind of the difference between, this is a funky example, but a tablespoon of mayonnaise has 100 calories, whereas it would take several cups of broccoli, like 2.5 cups of broccoli to equal 100 calories. So you could fill yourself up with broccoli, whereas if you ate a tablespoon of mayonnaise, there'd still be more room in your stomach for other food. I'm sorry, I wouldn't eat a tablespoon of mayonnaise by itself, but. And then the third principle for reaching optimal weight is to burn stored fat. So if we could design a situation where we burned the fat that we had stored in our body for our energy and didn't add any more fat to our storage system, that would be ideal. So we want to be able to do that, and there's a way we can do that, and that really is the magic of fat burning we're going to talk about still. When we are in fat burning, there's a few tips, and this little list is a great list that I would say you want to do kind of no matter what for the rest of your life. So eat within 30 minutes of waking would be the first tip. When we get up and haven't been eating for the time frame that we've been asleep, our metabolism is turned off to let us rest, and it knows that we need to conserve through the night. So when we eat a small healthy meal in the morning, it helps turn on our metabolism. Secondly, don't over-exercise, so 45 minutes maximum. This is particularly true in fat burning or in weight loss as a phase. There are certainly times in life that it's okay to do some slow, gentle exercise or to do exercise a little longer than 45 minutes, but you have to be really aware that that raises your stress hormone, or our cortisol, which is a fat storage hormone. And so over-exercising can actually take you out of fat burning because your body can think it needs to conserve the fuel that you have in your system. Drinking plenty of water. Robert recently was reading something that was awesome. Robert, do you want to share what you read about what happens to the fat that we burn? What are the two places it gets used up into?
Sure. Well, I don't know if anyone's ever wondered like what happens when you burn body fat, like where does it go? But there was a physician, I don't know where she was from school. Anyway, she was just curious about this. So she went back and did some research and posted it. But anyway, essentially, like from chemistry class in high school, our elements don't just disappear. They just change from one form to another. So typically our body gets rid of body fat in one of two ways. We either pee it out, we urinate it out, or we breathe it out. Most of it leaves our body in a liquid. So when you find yourself running to the bathroom a lot, that's a good thing. That's how you get rid of the body fat. So most of it leaves that way. And sometimes just through expiration, through breathing is also another place. And just a note around that, one of the ways you'll know that you're sort of in fat burning is sometimes because you are breathing out, literally breathing out fat. Some people notice their breath might be challenged a little bit during fat burning. So having what's that?
Not breathing challenge, but they may have bad breath.
They might have bad breath. Yeah. And that's a natural thing. It's a normal thing because you're burning body fat. So it's just, that can be a normal thing. And your sweat might be a little more kind of stinkier than normal sometimes. But again, that's a normal thing. We're getting rid of body fat. But that's one of two ways it leaves our body. So either we kind of pee it out or breathe it out. So you weigh less in the morning. Part of that reason is you've lost moisture from your body by breathing all night, and some of that moisture is some of that body fat too. So it's a good thing. So keep breathing, keep peeing, and watch the pounds go away.
Well, and that's why drinking plenty of water is such a critical component for fat burning, because if you're going to break down fat, you want to actually dissolve, or you want to dilute the toxins that have been stored in fat, and the fat's going to come out as urine and as carbon dioxide that you breathe out. But you can dilute the toxins by plenty of water and actually help them get out of your body. Sleep is also really critical to fat burning. If I have people that are going to be in a really sleep compromised state, I just let them know that may impact their weight loss or the rate of how fast they lose weight. Measuring food I think we're going to give you a quick and down and dirty way to do that. I just tell you it's the 9-inch plate. And literally, either you can measure your portions of protein to be between 5 and 7 ounces, or you can look at your plate and know that that's approximately 1/4 of a 9-inch plate to give you the right measurement on your protein for your day. Balancing carbs and protein is also critical. I'm going to talk a little more about that because that's kind of the key to keeping your blood sugar steady. And then keeping your total carbs for the day under 100 grams a day is another key. So earlier I mentioned that the average American diet is 450 grams of carbohydrates. So when you look at moving your carbohydrates to 100 grams a day, that is a significant reduction in carbohydrates. And it's interesting in the debates around whether it's caloric restriction versus carbohydrate restriction that causes weight loss. It looks like the winning team, so to speak. In other words, the preponderance of evidence is that it's the limitation of carbs in your day that actually cause the weight loss most effectively, not necessarily the limitation of calories. So even when you look at all the different commercial diets out there, many diets work from the standpoint of just losing weight. In other words, you can lose weight on lots and lots of different methods. And most all of them, the reason you're losing weight is because there's been a carbohydrate restriction, as well as a calorie restriction, but it seems to be the carb restriction that's the most effective. So this is why this works. This is a pattern of someone eating that's not eating healthfully. So this is someone eating a little bit more of that standard American diet where maybe they run out of the house in the morning with an orange juice. By mid-morning, if you had orange juice, let's say around 7 or 8 in the morning, and it made your blood sugar rise very high, your body would respond by making insulin, and you would spike an insulin surge in your bloodstream in order to take this blood sugar and deposit it into your cells, get it out of your bloodstream so that you reduced its toxicity. And when you have that deposition of blood sugar into the cells, your blood sugar plummets back down, because you had this overproduction of insulin in order to get rid of this over elevated blood sugar. So when your blood sugar plummets and you have a low blood sugar or hypoglycemic state, you have incredible cravings to fix this. So generally, this correlates really nicely with mid-morning in a lot of offices. This is coffee break time, so people go and get something else to fuel, to feed that craving. And again, if you have something that just spikes that blood sugar up high, your body sends out insulin to put that blood sugar away, your blood sugar crashes, and it's time for lunch, and you go searching for food again. This pattern keeps insulin high all day long, and that's the biggest take home of this slide, is that if your insulin stays high all the time, either because of this pattern, where we're eating foods frequently in response to the drop of blood sugar, or if you're eating very little during your day. Let's say you're eating a small amount, but then you're eating a huge dinner or a big late day meal. What will happen in that situation is you'll tend to have overproduced insulin after that big meal in order to put it away. And the body ends up starting to think it's in a stressed state and keeping insulin high even when you haven't eaten for the day, because it's going to have this big surge of food to deal with later. So whether you have high insulin because of these many frequent fuelings of food that spike the blood sugar, or because of long gaps in eating and your cortisol rising and drawing insulin up with it, if you have an elevated insulin level all the time, that is a key problem to causing fat storage. So what happens is that insulin is the switch. There are many hormones that affect how we burn calories or how we digest or what our body does with food and whether we store it as fat or burn it off. But insulin's really the number one hormone in that impact. So insulin acts like a switch. And when insulin levels are low, it tells us burn up fat. Let's get rid of excess fat. Let's burn it. But insulin that's high all the time actually makes us burn carbohydrates. We prefer, it's easier for the body to burn carbs when insulin is high. And the impact of burning those carbs is that they get stored as fat. So high insulin equals fat storage. This is another way of saying the same thing. bottom portion, this is the level of insulin. So the further right we go, the higher the insulin. The more to the left we go, the lower the insulin. And then this up and down on the x-axis, the y-axis is the fat breakdown. So if we have really low insulin, like if we were down at this level of 0 to 10, we have the highest amount of fat breakdown, 100% of fat breakdown at an insulin level of maybe 8 to 10 right here. Whereas if we end up with an insulin level that's higher, we slow down in our fat breakdown. So low levels of insulin are really critical to burning fat, and that's what we want. High levels of insulin mean we don't burn fat virtually at all. We've often thought that weight was only because of caloric intake and it wasn't a hormone issue, but it doesn't really make sense when you think about, we know that there are problems where people overgrow in their height, like we think of, people that are giants or people that have growth disorders where they really grow extremely tall or have extremely extremely long arms or legs as a growth hormone problem. But what we haven't really wrapped our brains around in this country is that obesity, or what we would think of as horizontal growth, growing wider, is also a hormone problem. We've tended to think it was something that was about lack of discipline or lack of self-regulation or, kind of slovenly laziness, or things that were really almost more like character defects when we think of obesity. And obesity really is a hormone issue that's as regulated by hormones as would be a height or an overgrowth in vertical growth. So if we were to say, okay, what's the alternative? If we looked at insulin and we said, okay, that's the key to figuring out a way to be in fat burning and to be at an optimal weight, how would we do that? So this is a picture of what it would look like if your blood sugar never spiked, if your blood sugar didn't rise into the stratosphere and cause your insulin to have to overproduce. So if you eat a meal that's a low glycemic index meal, where you have it's a balance of protein and carbohydrates, or it's the kind of food that would keep your blood sugar steady, your body doesn't have to overproduce insulin. And so because you don't have such a huge surge in insulin, you never have the crash in your blood sugar way below normal. So the cravings are a little bit more, they're minimal actually when you're in fat burning, because your body has what it needs, so it doesn't have to send you on a wild chase for food with a crashed blood sugar. So if you were to eat small, low glycemic meals and fuelings throughout a day, the insulin never has to spike or go really high. And when insulin stays near its baseline, near a normal level, which on a blood draw would be maybe a level of, like I said, maybe 5 to 8, something under 10 if you're drawing a level of insulin at the doctor's office. These low levels of insulin allow the body to stay in fat burning. So it's that switch that lets you not store fat and just burn fat. So when I mention low glycemic eating, what do I mean? What's the glycemic index? And let me just ask before I go to this, pause for a second. And does anybody have some specific questions or anything that I can clarify? Because I'm covering a fair bit of territory. I'm happy to clarify if there's something that hasn't been clear.
Let me just unmute everyone, Jeralyn, for a second.
Sure.
Oh, yeah, nice.
Is that making sense so far? Yes, it is. Cool. Okay, so I'm going to go into a little bit more about what does low glycemic mean. How do we do that?
And if anyone has any questions, you can also just type it in that little chat deal at the very bottom of your Zoom bar. You see the little chat deal. Just type a question there and we'll get to it in a moment.
Thanks, Robert.
You bet.
Okay, so if we eat low glycemic meals, and what is glycemic index? Glycemic index is a measure of food compared to sugar. And the reason we do that is sugar, we've thought of sugar as having the most pure effect of raising our blood sugar level. So if we were to have 50 grams of sugar, which is about 10 teaspoons of sugar, just to give you a reference, And we said, okay, let's say that 10 teaspoons of sugar, 50 grams of sugar, raises our blood sugar to a score of 100. How do every other food that we could eat, how do those foods compare to sugar? And that's called the glycemic index. So for instance, if I eat like raw edamame that are in the pod and I eat those have a 20 as a glycemic index. And what we know is that the amount of blood sugar increase is an indirect way to kind of gauge how much insulin is going to jump up as well. So if I ate 50 grams of sugar, I would expect that insulin spike, or excuse me, that blood sugar and insulin spike to go up, both up, like that first slide I showed you. So if we look at this first peak here, orange juice has a glycemic index that's very high. It's like above 85, depending on how much pulp is in the orange juice, because fiber lowers glycemic index. But if you have an orange juice and it raises your blood sugar 85% of what pure sugar does, that's going to give you this kind of spike. That's why it's not a healthy meal by itself. So when we look at low glycemic eating, we're going to start to look at foods that don't cause such a fast spike in blood sugar. So foods that are either slower in the way they raise our blood sugar, or foods that in and of themselves, the way that they're made, don't have as much sugar in them. So we sort of arbitrarily, and it's been because of a lot of studies showing what seems to be the most stabilizing to people's blood sugar, but we know that if a glycemic index of a food is 50 or lower, that we're not going to spike our blood sugar with that food. So what does that look like? So here's a list. This is from Dr. Anderson's book, Habits of Health. Here's a list of vegetables that have low glycemic indexes. So at the top half of this slide, where everything's green, these are all foods that have a glycemic index less than 30. So notice all the green veggies, peas are the only green veggie that are not on that upper half of the page. So things like asparagus, cucumber, broccoli, Brussels sprouts, green beans, all of those have an index less than 30, which means they raise your blood sugar less than a third of the amount plain old sugar would. And some of you that have been working on weight loss with us with Take Shape for Life know that during your weight loss phase, we ask you not to eat the things that are on the bottom of this page. So we suggest you not have peas and corn and beets and carrots, because those foods have a much higher glycemic index. But I want to point out something about the carrots. Does anybody notice this? Look at the raw carrots here at 30 and the cooked carrots at 80. Anybody have any thoughts about why that could be? Robert, you can unmute people so we can talk through this section a little bit more.
I would think it would be the fiber.
I was careful on self-shutting.
Yeah, I think you're right, Monica. Think about, this is a weird example, but I often think about these foods when they're more in the form of baby food. They're almost pre-digested, and you think about cooked carrots. What softer food is there than like a cooked carrot? Almost, you can imagine that as a really soft baby food.
Yep.
And to me, there's another place that this alludes to, and that is thinking about higher glycemic indexes. The more we blend up, mash up, squish up our food, it's almost like we're taking the job of our teeth, chewing it up, and doing it external to the body, and that makes it easier for the food to get into our bloodstream quickly. So just even, it's one of the reasons that mashed potatoes, I don't think are going to be on one of them that I show, but mashed potatoes have a much higher glycemic index than would a chunk of raw potato, for instance. So what I like about this comparison of the carrots and whether they're raw versus cooked, there's a higher sugar content in cooked carrots than in a raw carrot. And the other thing is, it's harder to eat a ton of raw carrots. Like, we've been munching on raw carrots some this break, and we had some really nice little organic carrots, and I can eat, 3 or 4 carrots of this particular size. They were kind of medium, small carrots. But if they were cooked, and especially if I mashed them like mashed potatoes, I could eat probably a cup or so of them, a lot more volume. So one of the beautiful things about vegetables is that because they have so much fiber, they have a lot of filling power. They're sort of they have a lot of fiber, but low calories for the amount of filling power that they provide. And those are excellent foods to choose when you're looking to both lose weight and maintain weight. If we go on to fruits, I think fruits can be one of the most confusing places. And we talked briefly about fruit last week. And I want to just say, to clarify, that if you're trying to lose weight, keeping fruits either out of the picture until you reach your goal weight, or only choosing those that are in this lowest glycemic index and keeping the portion really controlled on these makes a big difference. In most of my patients, when I'm guiding them around weight loss, I ask them to not have fruit at all, actually, during their weight loss phase, and then add it back in when we get to transition. Because the awareness of adding it back in and noticing what happens to their weight when we very gently add, 1 serving of fruit back in is a really helpful piece for them to learn how much they're going to be able to eat in the long run without getting in trouble. Because any foods that are high glycemic that we add back in without being really aware around the quantity that we eat of those can be a stopping point for maintaining a healthy weight. So if you're going to pick fruits, they have olives and avocado on this list, which I would actually have almost put in the healthy fat category. But you can see that citrus tends to be lower, and raspberries and blackberries tend to be lower. And so those would be the ones you would choose when you added those back in a low glycemic lifestyle. I honestly think, and this is probably why everybody talks about low carb diets, it's the stuff that's on this slide, and even things like starchy foods like potatoes, for instance. So when you think about where we can really mess ourselves up in trying to keep our carbs below 100, this is where it's easy to happen. When you look at most bars or most granola bars have a carbohydrate content that is significantly high, like 35 to 40 grams of carbohydrate just in one bar. So if you were trying to eat under 100 grams of carbohydrates in a day and you had 40 in your granola bar, you really wouldn't have left yourself much room for the rest of the day in your carbohydrates. And the reason the carbohydrates are what we need to limit, or why we would want to limit the starchy type of carbs, is that they hit blood sugar more than anything else. It's as if the type of starch that's in grain breaks down into sugar more quickly than any other food type. So when you look at this slide, in the long run, I would say when you're in maintenance, having quinoa, for instance, would be a reasonable choice for a starch. Or having sourdough bread, a couple times a month might be a reasonable choice. But when you're in weight loss, literally eliminating this calorie or this category would be the easiest way to keep your carbohydrate load below 100 in a day. And many of you that have looked into dietary theory know that, for instance, Atkins or some of the other, what I would think of as extremely low carb diets, even keep carbohydrates less than 20 or 50 grams a day, depending on the stage of those diets that you're in. So the reason is that they have an incredible impact on blood sugar. So even steel cut oats here at a glycemic index of 58 means that if you had a breakfast just of steel cut oats, you would raise your blood sugar with no balancing effect of the protein or fiber that you would really want in an ideal breakfast. And so literally in weight loss, just avoiding this category, this and fruit are the two things to not add into your diet if you're in a weight loss phase. Before I go on, go ahead and unmute people again, Robert. Any thoughts about glycemic index or food combinations? One of the examples, I don't know if I talked about this last week, but one of the examples that I like to suggest is if you're at a steakhouse and you think about what's typical on a plate at a steakhouse, usually a person would have a steak or a fillet, and there's often the choice of a baked potato and then some vegetable sides. And what you can do in that kind of a setting, if you're not in a weight loss phase and you're going to have the potato, so this is a maintenance trick. What you want to do is have an amount of potato that essentially balanced out the amount of protein that you were eating. So if you were having 25 grams of protein in your steak, ideally you would eat no more than 25 grams of carbohydrate in your potato. And so maybe you'd have a third of a potato or a half a potato and a side of vegetables alongside your steak, and that would create a balanced blood sugar effect in that meal. So when you think about these the glycemic index, the thing to do is to actually use it from a food combination pattern, so that, because protein doesn't raise your blood sugar virtually at all, and fat also has a very minimal effect. If you can balance the amount of carbs in combination with the protein that you're eating, so keeping those numbers almost identical if you were actually looking up grams of carbs versus protein, that will keep blood sugar steady. I just want to make a couple other comments. Many times when I show people the slide of eating 6 times a day, I know the first time I started to learn that, I groaned inwardly, because I thought, okay, there's just no way I'm having a hard enough time eating 3 times a day. How am I going to eat 6 times a day? And so I just want to make sure I clarify one of the reasons I started using portion controlled meal replacements in my office and with our patients was because eating 6 times a day and thinking through, okay, are my carbohydrates and protein balanced in every meal that I'm eating, can be challenging. And so I often will suggest to people that they start with a portion controlled meal replacement program like Take Shape for Life, and that's what Robert and I coach around, because it allows success while you learn how to do it. So you can have shopping lists, and we actually teach people shopping lists and teach them principles around balancing carbohydrate and protein for the long run. But when you're learning that, it's really helpful to have training wheels. And I think some of you on the call actually have experienced what it's like to lose weight really consistently on a portion controlled meal replacement option. And it's because they keep your blood sugar sustained and stable for 2 to 3 hours. They're pretty easy to use. You don't have to do a lot of planning and counting and cooking. They keep muscle by having enough protein in your day. You don't lose muscle, and that's a unique aspect of Take Shape for Life's program. And they help you get into a fat burning state and not feel hungry. So if you look at trying to maintain this kind of a blood sugar pattern, we know that portion controlled meal replacements are a really easy way to do that while you're learning how to build low glycemic meals for the long run. Sometimes I get asked, how on earth can that little amount of food, 5 meal replacements in a day and 1 meal of protein and vegetables is what Robert and I teach our clients to use. How can that actually be enough? Because that's, it's really calorie restricted and seems like so little. And the reason is that the meal replacements have actually been medically formulated to sustain all of these body systems. So every organ, your bone, the calcium balance in your bone, the muscle so that you don't lose muscle by having adequate protein, your brain, all of those systems are supported with the balanced nutrition in those 5 meal replacements a day plus your lean and green meal. And so we're able to go down to a much lower caloric intake, which does help with weight loss, but it does it in such a way that it balances out the hormone side of weight loss. So it's a balance both in lowering calories as well as balancing the hormonal impact in our bloodstream when you're on a program like Take Shape for Life. This is just a comparison, and you can see here at the bottom, MetaFast is listed. MetaFast are the products that we use in our Take Shape for Life program. And you can see the typical amount of weight lost in these different programs. This was Consumers Reports. Basically shows you that the greatest amount of weight loss in the least amount of time. So in 6 months on the diet, this was the amount of weight that people tended to lose, was actually most consistent and highest with MetaFast. And these other systems work because they are both caloric and carbohydrate amounts that are lower than the typical American diet. But when you look at results that are quick enough that people stay interested, that's one of the reasons Robert and I are so delighted that Take Shape for Life uses MetaFast as the meal replacement program that we use. So what we typically are doing to achieve those 6 small fuelings a day to keep blood sugar steady is we're doing 5 MetaFast meals, and 1 lean and green meal where it's protein and veggies on a 9-inch plate. 1/4 of your plate protein, 3/4 of your plate vegetables. And so I just want to say that not only do I think it's important that we have a really structured eating plan as we start trying to make a real direction change in our health, but that having a health coach or having a group like we have within the Healthy Games right now, there's a community that we've been developing and a health coach that you can ask for questions or ask questions of, and habits of health that we're learning, which in the Healthy Games are set up really to be in a game format where you get them in little doses, and they can be learned in other ways too that we like to help our clients with. But when we look at how do we help make the changes of learning low glycemic eating, last for a lifetime and move us towards long-term health maintenance, it's learning those patterns in a community of support that's going to keep us on track for the long term that really makes a difference. And so, some of the things I talked about tonight, we'll repeat parts of those even in our future calls, and some of it will sound a little repetitive because it's really the basis of what we need to keep reminding ourselves. But I just want to say thank you for being on the call tonight and take any questions or clarification that I can at this point if you have any questions.